Okay, so welcome back to this lecture on why Weimar Germany was in trouble in 1918 to 1923. So we've covered the armistice and the basic points of the Treaty of Versailles and why it was such a bad thing. We looked at stab in the back myth and crucially explained that Germany really had to sign it, so the Weimar politicians, including Jews and communists who got the blame, weren't really to blame. We looked at the terms of the treaty, and why they were so bad, and we left off with it leading to a worsening of the stab in the back myth. So often people get confused and think the stab in the back myth was that the Treaty of Versailles, the politicians etc. were blamed for signing the Treaty of Versailles. They were, but originally it started with the armistice as mentioned earlier. But signing the Treaty of Versailles, and this is how you link it back for your essay to the Treaty of Versailles, worsened the stab in the back myth. So just like with the armistice, it was social democratic politicians who had signed the Treaty of Versailles, so they were the big party led by Ebert, who we're going to talk about quite a bit in a minute. And the right wing could then link that group into communists and Jews. It made the armistice look like an even worse idea, because obviously when they signed the armistice, I don't think they realised quite how horrible the terms were going to be. It increased hatred of the Weimar Government and support for the right wing, and made them look really, really, really weak, because they couldn't do anything about the Treaty of Versailles, which was such a terrible punishment. So that's the linking bit at the end of your paragraph to show how, yes, the stab in the back myth started before the Treaty of Versailles, but the reason the Treaty of Versailles was the biggest problem was because it made the stab in the back myth look even worse, even more of an issue. So then you've got to link the Treaty of Versailles into the next bit of your essay, which is going to be on the rise of extremist groups. Now, that is broken down between the attacks from the left and the left wing, and the attacks from the right. Now, the main attack from the left wing, if you're doing your GCSE in 2017, that you need to know about is a Spartacist uprising. If you're doing it at a later date, there's a lot more in the early stages, and in the new GCSE there's a lot more where you might want to go into a bit more depth about this area. But for now, we're just going to focus on the Spartacist uprising of January 1919 and the Freikorps and Kapp Putsch, the Kapp Putsch supported by the Freikorps of March 1920. Now you will notice that the left-wing uprising of the Spartacists was January 1919, which is before the Treaty of Versailles. So this is one of those things you need to know about, but it's not a great bit of evidence to use if you're trying to argue that the Treaty of Versailles was the most important reason. And you'll have to decide, depending on what bullet points you're given in the essay, depending on the exact wording of the essay, whether to include it at all, because you don't want to detract from your consistent argument. So this happened before the Treaty of Versailles had been signed, and the people of Germany didn't realise how bad the Treaty of Versailles was going to be at this point. It was being discussed, but the terms were very much behind closed doors, so you can't really link this into the Treaty of Versailles. But from a knowledge perspective, we need to go over it. So let's go over the Spartacist uprising now and look at the key details of it. So it was left-wing. So the political spectrum goes from left-wing, the furthest left you can get in the political spectrum is communism, which is the idea that you should share wealth equally amongst people. And the furthest right you can get, at least as far as this course you need to know, is the Nazis, fascists, who tend to blame everything on Jews and blame everything on communists and on the kind of like weak governments in the centre. The centre would be the moderate parties like the Social Democrats run by Ebert, who was in charge at this point. So the communist uprising, they wanted the country to be communist. Okay, so for wealth to be distributed more evenly, potentially for the country to be run by sort of like small collectives and groups like that. It wasn't entirely clear whether they wanted it to become exactly like communist Russia, which took a more kind of dictatorial approach to communism. But either way, they weren't happy with Ebert, they weren't happy with the Social Democrats and the way the country was being run. So a group of workers rose up and said they were going to overthrow the government. And it's nice little play on words that they rose up because it was led by somebody called Rosa Luxemburg. So let's just watch this little video clip. No copyright infringement intended to Billy Bragg, who's made the song that goes behind this. But here is a video that tells us the key details of the Spartacist uprising. So they use the word radical socialists there, also known as communists. Interesting but not particularly useful information. So the two leaders you should try and remember is Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, who were the leaders of the Spartacist uprising. Politically similar to the Communist Party, so they'd come to power in Russia in 1917 and were by this point in 1919 running their country. Now the people back home were quite scared of communism, a lot of them were. They didn't really want what happened in Russia to happen in Germany, and in particular the soldiers who'd been fighting the Russians, let's not forget, didn't want their country to turn communist. So a lot of them were a little bit apprehensive about this uprising that was taking place. So the soldiers generally were not as left-wing as the general population. So they would support anybody who wanted to stop the communists. And they did this by joining groups called the Freikorps. And this were groups of battle-hardened ex-soldiers who were willing to do whatever it takes to stop a communist uprising, even if it meant supporting Ebert, who they weren't particularly keen on anyway, because he's one of the people who was involved in signing the armistice and so on. So the communist uprising took place in January 1919, and it was a futile gesture. Can you think why? Why would they not have overtaken the country? So Ebert withdrew to Weimar, very famous and important for two reasons. One, because it's the reason for Weimar Government being called Weimar Government, but secondly, as we'll discuss in a minute, it's because it's how he survived. And the second way he survived was to allow the Freikorps to put down the revolution, put down the communist uprising. So to answer the question I asked in a minute, the Spartacists who led it were able to be murdered, they were killed, and the thing was able to be put down because the Freikorps was much better organised, they were much better armed, and they had a military background. The Spartacists mostly did not. They didn't have the organisation. So it was a foregone conclusion that the Freikorps would win this battle. And sadly, Luxemburg and Liebknecht were killed. And then we're going to talk about the two main questions that you might get, because, like I say, this isn't necessarily that relevant for the Versailles question that we're working on as a 16 marker, but it's very common in a 9 marker. So how did he survive? He got the army and Freikorps to put down the Spartacists, what remained of the army, of course, and the Freikorps won because there was little public support for the Spartacists. The uprising was badly planned, and the Freikorps were trained soldiers, whereas the Spartacists were civilians. So the key thing that you're going to need to be able to answer on this is, why does it matter? Okay, so a group of people like rose up and then they got killed and that was it, right? Well, no, it matters and it's important because it highlighted how unstable the Weimar government was. You know, it was in its early days here. We're only 3 months into the government and they really were unstable. They had to run away from a group of workers. And it showed that the Republic was dependent on the support of the army to an extent, but realistically the Freikorps, because the army was so weak by this point, you know, there was maybe 1 million people in the German army before the end of the war, and most of these people were just sitting around with little to do. So they would join things like joining the Freikorps. So yeah, it really does highlight the strength of the Freikorps, the strength of the right wing really at that point in time, and the weakness of the new Weimar government. So, on the other hand, we have a right-wing uprising of the Freikorps, who supported somebody called Wolfgang Kapp. His name was Wolfgang Kapp. So his name was not Kapp Putsch. A putsch is another word for uprising, so I've seen that written in exam papers before. Mr. Kapp Putsch. No, that's not his name. His name was Wolfgang Kapp, and he led something called the Kapp Putsch. Also seen it referred to as the Freikorps uprising. So you just have to be careful, it is the same thing. And it's March 1920, and it's after the Treaty of Versailles, and much easier to link into the Treaty of Versailles, because the people on the right wing, as we know, were the most vehemently opposed to the Treaty of Versailles. So they were very, very cross with the Treaty of Versailles, very, very angry, and they wanted to stop it and overthrow it. A lot of them wanted to bring the Kaiser back as well. So anyway, what happened in this uprising? It took place in Germany in March 1920. Key details: Wolfgang Kapp was a right-wing journalist, so he wasn't a soldier himself, but he was against the government, and particularly keenly against the Treaty of Versailles. It was a direct threat to the Weimar government because he was assisted by somebody called General Luttwitz, who led a group of Freikorps men. Now, he seized Berlin and proclaimed, so he stated that a new right-of-centre nationalist government was being established with Kapp as Chancellor. So this was going to be a sort of type of dictatorship, I suppose, but that they wanted to have the sort of military back, and they wanted to be a very disciplined and well-organised country again, as they had been during and before World War One. So this was a bigger threat, really, to Ebert. Okay, it was a much bigger threat to his survival. Why? Well, firstly, the people who had saved him in the last uprising were now against him, and the army would not put down their friends, the Freikorps, because they were the same people, in effect. So, real big problem for him. So, what's he going to do about this? What's he going to do to survive? So, this is the thing he does. For the second time, he runs away. Okay, so he leaves his capital. Ebert becomes very famous for running away, and you can always say he's done that twice. He fled, he ran away, he disappeared. This time it was to Dresden. You don't necessarily need to know that for your exam, but that's where he went. And the only thing that he could do was to call for a general strike. Now, a general strike is when people refuse to go to work. And what that basically meant was that the movement was paralysed. They couldn't do anything because the people wouldn't keep the country running whilst they're trying to create their putsch. So all kind of a bit of a damp squib in the end. The workers refused to go to work, and Kapp sort of took his guns away and went home, and doomed the putsch to failure, and Kapp and Luttwitz fled on March 17th. So what seemed like an extremely big threat was put down by Ebert quite successfully. But again, you're much more likely to get a question on why it was a problem than why he survived. So let's just focus on that. So what was important about it? Why is it a big deal? And why does it show, if we're using the words of the question, that the Weimar government was in trouble? Firstly, Ebert had to flee his capital, which shows how weak he was. Secondly, he had to rely on the people for a general strike. Again, highlighting his weakness because he couldn't use the army. So he had no power over the army, at least in as far as dealing with something like the Freikorps. So he couldn't use his army. He was very weak, and the Weimar government, again, looks to be completely weak. That said, and again, this is a bit of a counter-argument to what I think you should be putting in your essay, but kind of like if you do get a slightly differently worded question, you may want to mention the fact that people agreed to the strike. They wanted to go for the strike, so they didn't have an appetite for extremists taking over the country. So perhaps there was actually a bit more support for democracy underlying there than people might have thought. So the final thing that we're going to go on to next, that the Treaty of Versailles led to, was hyperinflation.